When no contact begins, something interesting happens in the avoidant nervous system that most people misunderstand. From the outside, it looks like indifference, silence, relief even. And in the beginning, that's often true. For an avoidant, no contact can feel like oxygen. The pressure is gone. The expectations disappear. The emotional intensity that felt overwhelming is suddenly quiet. And many people misread this phase and assume they don't care. They've moved on. But psychologically, that's not what's happening. What's happening is suppression, not resolution. Avoidants are wired to manage closeness by creating distance. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling too much, especially dependence, vulnerability, or loss of autonomy, registers as danger. So when contact stops, their system initially stabilizes. The threat appears neutralized. But here's the critical point. Avoidance only works in the short term. Distance soothes the nervous system temporarily, but it does not erase emotional bonds. It doesn't process attachment. It postpones it. As days turn into weeks, something subtle begins to shift. The silence stops feeling like relief and starts feeling like absence. And absence is very different from space. Space implies choice. Absence implies finality. This is the moment where emotional distance transforms into perceived loss, and that's when the avoidant psyche starts to crack. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We don't just react to what happens, we react to what we believe it means. At first, no contact means good, things are calm. Later, it starts to mean they're not here. And eventually, if the silence continues, it becomes they may never be here again. That interpretation changes everything. Avoidants often don't miss people in the same way anxious types do. They don't sit in longing or nostalgia early on. Instead, they miss patterns. They miss roles. They miss emotional reference points. They miss knowing where they stand. And when you are truly gone, not checking in, not reacting, not subtly signaling availability, you remove a stabilizing emotional constant from their world. That's when the loss becomes real. And here's where philosophy intersects with psychology. We value what we experience as finite. Scarcity creates meaning. Permanence creates complacency. As long as an avoidant believes you are emotionally accessible in the background, waiting, hoping, open, they don't fully register your value. Not because they don't respect you, but because certainty numbs perception. When certainty disappears, awareness sharpens. This is why avoidants often reach out long after a breakup, sometimes months later, sometimes at moments that seem random. It's not random. It's when the internal story shifts from this connection is paused to this connection may be over. Loss doesn't hit them immediately. It hits them when their autonomy is no longer being defended against closeness, but against emptiness. There's also an identity component here that doesn't get talked about enough. Relationships don't just give us companionship, they give us a mirror. Even avoidants, who prize independence, unconsciously organize parts of their identity around the presence of a familiar other. When that mirror disappears completely, it destabilizes self-concept. They start to feel unanchored, and the mind, seeking equilibrium, reaches back toward what once provided orientation. Now, it's important to understand this clearly. When avoidants break no contact at this stage, it's not always because they've had a sudden emotional awakening or are ready for deep intimacy. Often it's because the loss has finally registered in the body. The nervous system is now responding not to closeness as a threat, but to absence as a threat. And the human system will always move toward what feels like regulation. This is also why no contact only works when it's real. Not performative, not strategic silence filled with hope and monitoring. When you genuinely detach, when your energy withdraws, when your life reorganizes without them at the center, that's what creates the psychological shift. Avoidants are highly attuned to energetic changes, even if they're not emotionally expressive. They sense when access has been removed, not just reduced. And here's the paradox that challenges a lot of people: the moment they feel the loss is often the moment you are no longer trying to be missed. That's not coincidence. That's alignment. When you stop orienting your behavior around their reactions, you reclaim your center. And that reclamation is what alters the relational dynamic. This point flows directly into what comes next, because once loss is felt, another mechanism activates: the fear of losing control. But control only becomes relevant after loss is perceived. First comes the realization something important is no longer guaranteed. That realization destabilizes the avoidant's internal equilibrium. And from that instability, behavior changes. But let me be very clear about one thing, because this matters ethically and psychologically. The goal here is not to trigger someone into chasing you. That's manipulation. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself in order to maintain proximity. No contact is not a tactic to provoke pain. It's a boundary that allows truth to surface. And when truth surfaces, people respond according to who they are and where they are developed. Sometimes avoidants break no contact because they want to reconnect. Sometimes they do it to soothe discomfort. Sometimes they do it to test whether the door is still open. And sometimes they don't reach out at all. And that outcome, as hard as it is also information. Because the deepest power you gain through no contact isn't influence over them. It's clarity within yourself. When emotional distance turns into real loss, something irreversible happens on both sides. They are forced to confront what they've avoided. And you are forced to confront what you deserve. And that intersection where awareness meets self-respect is where real transformation begins. So here's the truth to leave you with. When someone finally feels your absence, it's not because you disappeared. It's because you stopped disappearing from yourself. Once loss is felt, another force comes online almost immediately. And this one operates at a deeper level of the avoidant psyche. It's not about missing you anymore. It's about losing control. And control for an avoidant is not about dominance over another person. It's about regulating their inner world. Control is how they stay safe. Avoidants don't experience safety through closeness. They experience safety through predictability and autonomy. As long as they believe they understand the relational terrain, who wants what, who will reach out, who will wait, they can stay emotionally regulated. Even conflict can feel manageable if the roles are familiar. What destabilizes them isn't emotional intensity, it's uncertainty. And no contact, when done fully, introduces a level of uncertainty they are not prepared for. In many avoidant relationships, there is an unspoken contract. You may be upset, but you'll stay. You may pull back, but you won't disappear. You may want more, but I set the pace. That contract allows the avoidant to feel in control without ever consciously asserting it. When no contact is initiated and sustained, that contract is silently broken. And the moment that happens, the avoidant sense of control begins to erode. At first, this loss of control is subtle. They may think about you more than expected. They may feel irritation or restlessness without knowing why. They may check their phone more often. These aren't signs of longing yet, they're signs of destabilization. The mind is searching for a familiar pattern that no longer exists. Psychologically, control is a compensatory strategy. When early emotional environments were unpredictable, inconsistent, or intrusive, the nervous system learns that safety comes from self-reliance. Depending on others feels risky. So the system adapts by minimizing need. Over time, control becomes synonymous with survival. So when an avoidant loses the ability to predict or access you, it doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels unsafe. This is where many people misunderstand why avoidants break no contact. They assume it's a romantic impulse. Sometimes it is, but often it's regulatory. Reaching out is a way to restore equilibrium. A simple message, hey, how have you been, can serve as a diagnostic test. Am I still important? Do I still matter? Is the door still open? The content may seem casual, but the underlying motive, Asian, is profound. And here's where the philosophy matters. We often think of freedom as the ability to act without constraint. But psychologically, freedom without grounding turns into anxiety. Humans need both autonomy and connection to feel whole. Avoidants lean heavily on autonomy, but when autonomy becomes isolation, it loses its stabilizing function. That's when the psyche reaches back toward connection, not necessarily for intimacy, but for orientation. No contact disrupts the avoidant's internal hierarchy. Before, they could tell themselves, I'm choosing distance. Now, distance feels chosen by someone else. And that shift is critical. Choice reinforces agency. Loss of choice threatens identity. When they realize they are no longer the one setting the terms, the relational dynamic flips. And power dynamics always become visible when they change. This is why avoidants may suddenly become more expressive, more curious, or even more emotional than they ever were in the relationship. Not because they've transformed overnight, but because the system is attempting to regain balance. Control is not about winning, it's about restoring a sense of internal coherence. But here's the deeper layer that often goes unnoticed. When control disappears, avoidants are forced to confront something they've been avoiding all along, their dependence. Not emotional dependence in the dramatic sense, but the quiet human truth that we are shaped by our attachments, whether we admit it or not. Losing control exposes the illusion of total independence. This can be profoundly uncomfortable, and discomfort is a catalyst. It either leads to growth or to defensive behavior. Some avoidants reach out to genuinely reconnect, sensing that something meaningful is slipping away. Others reach out to reassert distance once they confirm they still have access. This is why breaking no contact does not automatically signal readiness or emotional availability. It signals activation. And this is where your role becomes crucial, not in how you respond, but in how you interpret. If you believe their outreach restores the old dynamic, you may unconsciously step back into it. But if you understand that this moment is about their loss of control, not your obligation to soothe, you can stay grounded. You can observe without abandoning yourself. The most powerful thing about no contact is not that it provokes a reaction. It's that it removes your participation in a dysfunctional loop. And when you step out of the loop, the other person is forced to experience the full consequences of their coping strategy. That experience is often what catalyzes awareness. Control only feels necessary when trust is absent, and trust at its core is the belief that connection will not cost you yourself. Avoidants often haven't learned that yet. So when they lose control, they are confronted with a choice: double down on avoidance or risk a new way of relating. This point naturally leads into the next phase, because when control is gone and the old patterns no longer work, something even more destabilizing happens. The familiar emotional script breaks down, predictability vanishes, and that disruption, more than loss or control, forces real introspection. So here's what to leave this section with. When someone reaches out because they've lost control, the real power isn't in their message. It's in your ability to stay centered and choose differently, because the moment you stop needing control is the moment you finally have it. Once control is destabilized, something even more unsettling begins to happen for the avoidant. The familiar emotional patterns that once kept them regulated stop working. And this is where things get real, because human beings don't just attach to people, we attack. To roles, rhythms, and predictable emotional scripts. And avoidants, perhaps more than anyone, rely on those scripts to function. Every relationship has a pattern. Who reaches out first? Who explains? Who waits? Who smooths things over? Who tolerates ambiguity? In avoidant anxious dynamics especially, these roles become deeply entrenched. The avoidant distances. The other person bridges the gap. Over time, this isn't just behavior, it becomes a psychological ecosystem, and ecosystems feel stable even when they're unhealthy. Avoidants may not consciously enjoy the dynamic, but they depend on it. They know where they stand inside it, they know what to expect, and expectation is soothing to the nervous system. When no contact is introduced and sustained, that entire emotional rhythm collapses. There is no one chasing, no one clarifying, no one absorbing the emotional labor. The silence doesn't just remove communication, it removes structure. This is where many avoidants begin to feel a discomfort they can't name. It's not heartbreak yet, it's not longing, it's disorientation. The internal autopilot that once guided their relational behavior suddenly fails. The moves that always worked, pulling back, staying vague, delaying, no longer produce the same outcome. And when a strategy stops working, awareness is forced to emerge. Psychologically, this is significant. Much of avoidance operates unconsciously. It's not a calculated choice, it's a conditioned response. Distance regulates, independence soothes, emotional minimization prevents overwhelm. But when the environment changes, the nervous system has to update its model of reality, and that updating process is uncomfortable. Growth always is. When the familiar emotional pattern breaks, avoidants are often left alone with feelings they've spent a lifetime outrunning. Not dramatic emotions, quiet ones, emptiness, uncertainty, a low-grade sadness that doesn't have an obvious cause. And because they're not practiced at sitting with these states, the mind begins searching for meaning. This is often when memories surface. Not idealized fantasies, but moments of connection they didn't fully register at the time. Laughter, support, familiar presence. And here's the paradox. Avoidants often appreciate intimacy most in retrospect, once it no longer threatens their autonomy. When closeness is gone, it becomes safe to feel. This doesn't mean they suddenly become emotionally fluent. It means the protective distance that once kept feeling suppressed is no longer effective. And suppressed emotions don't disappear. They wait. When the pattern breaks, they rise. From a philosophical standpoint, this is the moment where habit gives way to choice as long as we live inside automatic patterns we believe we are acting freely. But true freedom only appears when the pattern fails. When the old response no longer fits, we are forced to ask, what am I actually doing here? That question is uncomfortable and transformative. Avoidants breaking no contact at this stage often aren't trying to rekindle the old dynamic consciously. They're trying to restore familiarity. They want to see if the pattern still exists. Will you respond the same way? Will you step back into your role? Will the system reboot? And how you respond or don't determines whether growth is possible. This is why so many people feel confused when avoidants reach out but don't follow through. The outreach itself is not resolution. It's a stress test, a probing of the old emotional infrastructure. And if that infrastructure is still intact, the avoidant often retreats again, reassured that nothing has fundamentally changed. But when the pattern doesn't reassemble, when you remain grounded, self-directed, emotionally contained, something remarkable happens. The avoidant can no longer outsource emotional regulation. They can no longer rely on the other person to carry the relational tension. They are forced inward, and inward is where avoidance loses its power, because avoidance is not the absence of feeling, it's the avoidance of awareness. When familiar patterns dissolve, awareness floods in. And with awareness comes responsibility. Responsibility for one's impact, responsibility for one's choices, responsibility for what was lost. This is the point where real reflection becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. Some avoidants lean into it. They begin to question their patterns. They feel grief, not just for the relationship, but for how they show up in connection. Others resist, they distract, they detach further. And some disappear entirely. Again, that outcome is information. What matters most here is not what they do, but what you do internally. Because when emotional patterns break, there is a vacuum. And vacuums get filled either with self-respect or with old conditioning. If you rush to restore familiarity at the cost of your growth, the pattern survives. If you tolerate the discomfort of the unknown, something new can emerge. This stage flows directly into the final trigger, because once patterns are disrupted and introspection begins, external events take on new meaning. Life pressures, loneliness, seeing you thrive. These experiences land differently when the old emotional script is gone. They no longer get filtered through habit. They hit raw awareness. So here's the truth to hold on to. When familiar patterns collapse, it's not chaos, it's opportunity. Because the moment someone can no longer relate to you automatically is the moment they are finally capable of relating to you consciously.